So the topics that we ran the training for the other day were aimed at, well, the training was aimed at topics that are about an observation and whether the observation is true or not. There are other kind of topics that also come up in debating, and in the first round we're going to use some of these. They're about a policy, so the question is less about is this observation true, it's more about is this policy a good idea. And that means it's a slightly different structure that will be needed if you're the affirmative and if you're the negative teams. So I'll go through that, and if you have any questions you can send us an email or get in touch with the people at IMBG or the Debating Society. The first part of the structure for the affirmative, instead of the context that we talked about before, is now going to be called an imperative. And it's very similar because you still come up with reasons about, or I guess an explanation of what is the status quo, what is reality as we understand it. But you also need to add in a dimension of why is it actually bad? What is the problem that we're going to try to solve in this debate? So the status quo is no longer an observation in the context, it's now also a problem that needs to be solved. The second part of the structure of the affirmative team is a model, and this is different from the values, the hierarchy of values that we talked about in the previous session. A model is much more practical and less abstract than the values are. It's your solution to the problem in the status quo. And it requires some basic details like what's it going to involve, who are the actors going to be that implement it, normally a government or some kind of agency, when will it take place, where will it take place, and how is it going to solve the problem. The step beyond that, for the third part, is different from your criteria. It's now going to be called your moral or logical justification for the model. So why, basically, is it fair? Not why is it a good idea, we'll come to that later, but why is it fair and justified for you to implement this model? That requires some kind of principle that your team is going to be prepared to stand by for the whole debate, and all of the arguments and benefits that you bring up later on are going to be brought back to this principle that you believe in about why your model is fair. There are general examples of that come up very often. Some of them are that does the government have a role to protect its citizens? If it does, that might be one justification for a model. Or do we want to protect individual liberties, like bodily autonomy or freedom of speech, these kinds of things? Or is your model a proportional response to a problem that exists? So it's like the punishment you're advocating for somebody proportionate to their crime, and that's why you justify your model. So there are different ways you can approach a justification, but basically it's a principle that everything is going to be linked back to throughout your whole case. The fourth and final part of the affirmative case is very similar to the fourth part that we talked about the other day. These are your arguments or your benefits. So the nice outcomes that stem from implementing your model. And the first speaker might get to come up with one of those, but generally the benefits will get talked about in 2 or 3 arguments that come out at the second speaker. The negative team also has a similar but only slightly different structure to follow. The first thing they come out with is a position on what the affirmative has brought, and this is only a 2 or 3 sentence indication of what's going to come up in their case and how they respond to the principle outlined in the affirmative. The second part of the negative speech, or the first negative speech, will be a rebuttal, so knocking down the points and the arguments made by the affirmative speech. Then they have their own justification for what they believe in, the principle they're going to stand by. For example, if the affirmative team talked about the role of government being to protect their citizens, the negative team might have a principle about individual liberty and how if the government intervenes that diminishes individual liberty. So those 2 principles will be the main clash in the debate. And again, the fourth part of the negative team's case is the benefits to their side or the disadvantages of the affirmative side. So similar kind of structure to before, but slightly more practical. You have a model and a justification rather than a hierarchy of values and a criteria. It makes it less abstract, and we hope it'll make the topics easier to tackle in the first round. If you have any questions, send us an email or get in touch with us any way you can. Best of luck.